Okay, so on this tutorial I'm decided to do a tree bark sphere texture. This is part of a series of different texture spheres. I've done different ones that include lava and ice, for example. So the idea being that I take something like a sphere shape and I apply a texture to it and give you a bit of a run through of how to construct the look and the lighting of the texture on a round shape, and hopefully then you'll be able to apply that to other forms of your own choosing. So for this particular texture, I've created a colour palette. I'll just set it as my default, and you can see here it's based around the birch tree, so that's why I've entitled it Birch Texture, and I've selected a range of colours. Now the top colours are probably going to be the colours that I use the most, although I've got some slightly more vibrant colours there that I may use in the mix as well. Now the app I'm using is Procreate, and if you want to use these exact colours, then in the description to this video below I'm going to be placing all the hexadecimal codes for each of these colours. Now whenever you click on a colour, it has a corresponding code, and like I say, they will all be down in the description, so you can just copy those, place them into this box, press enter, and then you should be able to use that colour. I do share the colour palette file with my patrons over at Patreon, and in addition to that, for free, I'm providing this template. It's like a grid, a guide, because I'm doing spheres and I want to just keep in mind that I am trying to create a texture that wraps around this kind of 3D looking shape. So this template is available for free on my Patreon page. If you want to, again, check the link in the description below and you can go and access this and download this for free. Now it is independent of the background, so it is a transparent layer. You can change the colour of the background and you'll still see the grid as a translucent layer on top. So I'm going to set the background just as a neutral colour to begin with, and I'm going to be using airbrushes mainly, predominantly for this. It is possible to use all the different kind of textures, but rather than just using a brush to generate a texture, I'm trying to show you how to do it more manually. So I will be using the airbrushes for this activity. Okay, so I have pre-selected these colours, but that isn't necessarily going to mean that I'm going to use them in any particular order, or indeed that I'll use them all. I've just put together the kind of colours that I think that I will use, but we'll see as we go along. So the first thing we're going to do is create another layer, and the first colour I'm going to use is this cool colour here. So it's not the first one, it's not the brightest colour on my colour palette. I'm going to use that for the highlights. I'm going to use the next colour along, which is this bluey kind of colour. And what I'm going to do to begin with, I'm going to use a middle kind of size brush. So based on the soft air brush, it's at about 4%, and I'm turning the opacity down. And I'm going to use the grid here, the guide, to inform me of the kind of direction of some of the shapes that I'm going to use. Now, I don't want it to be perfect. It is an organic element. It's going to be like a tree, obviously. So we're going to get some sort of undulating shapes that don't abide by a strict grid, obviously. I'm just starting to get a feel for some of the curves, some of the waves that may appear. But the grid itself is going to inform just a little bit some of the kind of direction. Perhaps when we get to the edges, you get a constricting, a sort of narrowing of shapes that get closer together. So it is going to be useful to have this guide, but perhaps not essential. I think it's useful for me personally, so that's why I'm using it. Just reminds me of the kind of overall shape that I'm aiming for. It isn't just a round flat surface, it is a 3D sphere. So it may be as I get up towards the top area that I'm starting to follow the lines of the guide a bit more accurately. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the guide above what I'm doing so you can still see it nice and clearly. Again, at the bottom area here, I'm going to perhaps just use the guide a bit more, and maybe it's just the center area where it deviates a little bit more. I'm not bothered about some areas that may go over the edge of the guide. This is tree bark, and it's the particular tree that I'm trying to generate the effects of. Birch will have a lot of textured bits that do come loose, that peel off, and so any slight bump that goes beyond the grid is absolutely fine for this subject. Now, I'm going to have the light coming from this side. There may be a kind of secondary light source that hits it slightly at this angle, but most of the light is going to hit this edge. So what I'm thinking, now that I've started to get some of these lighter tones in there, I'm thinking that I'm going to have a predominantly warm light coming from this top area. So I'm going to move along now to the slightly warmer colour, and I'm going to use this to go over the top of some of these forms. I might keep the cool light in this region, but the top right I'm going to do some slightly warmer tones. I want to leave some gaps, and it should become more apparent how the gaps are important later on, but this is very much a broken texture. I'm going to move along to another colour, slightly darker colour. So like I said, the light's hitting mostly there, so that means that in the region, this area, you're going to get some of the slightly darker tones, maybe some more greens coming into the mix. Just building up gradually. I'm going to move along. So I do have a range of colours here that are quite similar to each other. They're not going to make a massive difference. They're just subtle shifts and variations, just so it doesn't become too flat. You may have a slight change from one type of green into another type of green, slightly warmer version. I do think when you're trying to create texture, I think having variation is quite important. So again, I'm just trying to create some irregular features here, maybe some knots in the wood. So I have a range of different warm colours here as well, but I'm just going to use the darkest version now. I'm going to turn the size of the brush down, and I'm going to start picking out some darker contrasting. In fact, I'm going to do this on a different layer, and I'm going to use this to start really identifying where there are some more key features, maybe some gaps, some splits, and this is going to be crucial really. So this is going to be quite irregular again. So the light's hitting from the top side, so whenever you get like a feature like this, it's going to be light hitting the top there, and then maybe underneath it you're going to get more shadow. So I'm going to create quite a lot of broken texture here too. I'm also going to create some sort of rings that flow underneath, and then gradually flatten out until they become flatter like this. So it starts off, maybe starts off with more of a curve at the top. And then flattens out here. I'm going to create another feature in this area too. Maybe create some extra features down here as well. So there's definitely going to be some points at which there's a lot of shadowed, dark texture to contrast with the light parts. I think that's one of the most interesting things about Birch, is that you tend to get bands of different tones. So you're going to have some very light tones as well as some very colourful hues that spread through, but it generally goes in stripes and bands, especially when you get the bark starting to peel off through the different seasons. It tends to reveal different colours underneath. So I'm starting to do some smaller dashes now. These small dashes are going to be extremely important. It's one of the most identifiable features of Birch. It's quite a light surface, but then you have lots of these sort of little dashes that appear in there as well. Again, I'm using the lines here as a guide. I'm obviously not sticking to them, but you can see here I'm doing the general direction of these dashes that flow, roughly speaking, with the guide, and then if I'm doing more up here, they will flow roughly with the guide as well. But that's not to say it can't deviate from there. So we'll come back to adding more dark features like that. I'm going to create another layer first of all, and I'm going to go to the warmest of these browns, and I'm going to start adding some of this reddy brown tone into this area here. In fact, I think I could ramp that up a bit. I've got a really quite vibrant orangey red here, and I think that it will do it no harm just to add a real splash of colour into this region. Concentrate it up here and then it fades down. And I might do it in some of these regions too, and indeed there. I'm also on this layer going to start adding some greens in the mix as well. So really getting some stronger colours coming through here. So this is like the moss that may form on the bark. So I can move between the light and the dark green here. Okay, so at this point I'm going to get rid of the grid, just so I can really focus on what I've actually got. And I'm going to go back to the layer with all the really sharper, darker features. And I'm really going to focus in. I'm going to in fact turn the size of the brush down, turn the opacity up. And I'm really going to sharpen up some of these dash shapes that I was talking about. Sometimes these dashes join together, and this seems to be where the bark starts to peel from. So when looking at these particular forms that appear in the bark, they almost look like real kind of wounds that you might expect to see on flesh, and they will often have a real kind of 3D element to them. So you'll also get a bit of a kind of bump, almost where it's like scar tissue. So you might have a bit of a highlight on the top just to further exaggerate that it's a bit more raised on that top edge. Again, you might also get a bit of warmth, a little bit of the orangey brown coming in there in the mix. So I'm just going to move across the image now, adding lots more of those dashes using that technique. Again, using the flow here, it will follow the line that we've already created. The only point at which it tends to become interrupted is these concentration areas of like a really distorted, deformed kind of area. So I'm allowing the lines to become slightly less clear, make the opacity less as it gets towards the edge. It creates the effect that it's going around, it's becoming slightly less focused. But anything that's going to be in the central area here has to be really sharp, really focused. Perhaps the darkest colours, the most vibrant colours are going to be in the centre region. So again, I'm allowing these dashes to join up in areas, so they perhaps joining one area to another across the piece, but then there's going to be plenty of other times where it's just a dash on its own. So again, if I move back to the highlights, I'm just going to pick up the top edge of some of these dashes and some of this texture. Again, there's a light source coming from over this area. I'm just going to use the highlights now to bring out some of these shapes a little bit more clearly. Perhaps the warmest of these, rather than the white. The white, I've just tried it, it seems a little bit too intense, so I'm going for the warmer of the pale tones and using this to help these features stand out a bit more. I think what I'm going to also do is create a sense that there's some sections that are peeling off on the edges here. I'm going to create some more centrally as well, but I'm just going to create some bits that maybe appear to be folding away, peeling away, just at the outer edge here, just a suggestion. Again, I will do a more focused version more centrally as well, but I'll do just a couple on the edge here just to add to the effect. So it almost comes off in bands, curls, like this. I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to put it on top. I'm going to use this layer to add some sense of highlight. So I've got my blue tone here that I was using before, and I'm going to use this just to help bring in the idea that there's a secondary light source here that's perhaps a bit cooler, but it is quite reflective, the birch. The surface is quite smooth, quite shiny, so I'm just going to help with the suggestion that there's a brighter, cooler source coming in from the bottom left region, and then I'm going to perhaps exaggerate the warmer light as well. Okay, I'm going to go to my darker tone now. I'm going to really start to darken off some areas as well as the light tones. I want to make some features a little bit darker as well. Okay, so I'm going to use this layer also to start to suggest some areas that are peeling away. So I'm going to start introducing this just carefully, finding my way with it a little bit at a time. So I want to create just a section here that seems to be peeling away. Maybe another section there. I don't want to go overboard with the lines on this. I can always remove them slightly with highlights. But you're certainly going to get a darker area behind any bits that are coming off, because obviously it's going to cast a shadow. So once I've found my edge, some sections that are peeling away in curls, then I can create a shadow immediately behind those as well, and probably on the in-between too. I think I'm going to add some warmer tones into there. Perhaps I'll go to the red, slightly larger brush. Also going to go to my highlights just to really pick up the edges of these. Get rid of the black line that was on the edge. It was only there just to begin with. Now I'm going to use the highlight because it's really going to pick up on the light source as much as anywhere else. Again, I've been adding lots of darker tones using the real dark colour just to bring in some finer detail, really sharpen up some of the dark edges. But I'm now going to use some of the light green again to really pull out some of the highlights in areas. So when people ask me what brushes I use, I always find it slightly an interesting idea really that brushes can do the work for you, because they really can't. I think to be fully in control of the image that you're wanting to produce, you need to be able to do the textures yourself. I much prefer being in control of the process, really trying to get to grips and understand how textures are formed. I don't think there's a brush around that would do this job for you. So because it's such a reflective surface, I'm using some bright colours like this purple, because any surrounding light, especially if you were to look at this sort of later in the evening, sort of dusk time, you're going to get some of these colours bouncing off it. As you can see, I'm just adding in some slight more complications into the mix. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for today. I get really obsessed with the details. This is something I could spend many hours on, but in terms of achieving the overall effect that I wanted to, and just give you a bit of a run through about how I would approach this, I feel like I've achieved what I wanted to. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people that are supporting me over on my Patreon page. There is a link for that down in the description. Again, if you want the guide and the grid that I used for this piece, that is available for free over there as well. Make sure to press the bell notification button next to the subscribe button, and I shall catch you back here again. See you later.